The palace clock ticked relentlessly, echoing through the long marble halls like a drumbeat of history. Every second mattered. Beyond the carved wooden doors, a historic summit waited. Leaders from across continents had flown thousands of miles to sit in the same room. They expected one man to step forward, shake hands, and negotiate decisions that could alter the fate of nations. That man was President Ibrahim Traoré. Cameras had already been positioned, journalists rehearsed their live reports, and security details lined the corridors. The world believed this meeting was too important to be interrupted. Yet, what happened next shattered every assumption about what true leadership really means. Traoré, dressed in a neatly pressed uniform, walked slowly toward the conference chamber. His aides whispered final reminders about agendas, trade deals, and diplomatic protocols. Every eye was on him. But before his hand touched the heavy brass handle, his phone vibrated with an urgent message. It wasn't from a minister, or a general, or even another head of state. It was from a distressed voice on the ground, reporting something entirely different. A child was trapped, fighting for life only a few streets away. The contrast was almost unbearable. On one side, the polished world stage, filled with men and women who believed they carried the weight of nations. On the other, a single fragile life, unimportant to politics, yet infinitely valuable in its innocence. Many leaders would have silenced. The phone, pocketed it, and marched into history's spotlight. But Traoré froze. His mind raced, not with policy talking points, but with the image of a child in danger. His advisors noticed his hesitation. One leaned close and whispered, "Sir, the world is waiting. They will not understand a delay." Another reminded him that canceling or even postponing the summit would send shockwaves through diplomacy, risking credibility and alliances. But Traoré was no ordinary leader. He turned slowly, his voice calm yet firm, and said words that stunned everyone in the EO corridor. "The world can wait. That child cannot." The silence that followed was heavy, almost unbearable. One aide gasped audibly, another shook his head in disbelief. But Traoré had already begun moving in the opposite direction, away from the grand doors, away from the cameras, away from the prepared speeches. Instead, he rushed toward the exit that led to the streets beyond the palace walls. Outside, the city pulsed with noise, market sellers shouting, motorcycles weaving through traffic, and the scent of dust mixing with roasted food. Traoré's convoy, normally reserved for diplomatic parades, now became a vehicle of urgency. Sirens wailed as the cars sped through narrow roads, startling pedestrians who looked up to see the unlikely sight of their president not heading to a summit, but to an emergency. The destination was not a state building, not a military base, but a crumbling neighborhood where danger was far more immediate and human. As the convoy screeched to a halt, Traoré stepped out without hesitation. The crowd recognized him instantly. Mothers clutching children gasped. Men shouted his name, and phones lifted into the air to record the surreal moment. Yet his attention was fixed entirely on a collapsed construction site, where screams echoed from within the rubble. Witnesses shouted that a child was trapped beneath broken beams and scattered bricks. Dust clouded the air, making it hard to see, but the sound of muffled crying was undeniable. For a man trained to command armies and lead a nation, this was not a battlefield he had prepared for. But instinct, not protocol, drove him. Removing his jacket, rolling up his sleeves, he stepped into the chaos himself. Security guards panicked, urging him back, but he refused. "If we wait, the child dies," he shouted, his voice carrying over the noise. Villagers, construction workers, and even his own guards began working furiously, pulling aside heavy planks and digging with bare hands. The cameras that had been waiting at the summit now had a different story. Citizen journalists recording, on their phones, captured a head of state kneeling in dust, sweat pouring down his face, dirt staining his hands as he lifted debris piece by piece. It was no longer about negotiations or protocols. It was about humanity, raw and unfiltered. Minutes stretched into eternity. Each new slab removed revealed more rubble, more danger, but also a faint hope. Then, a cry, a clear, piercing cry that silenced the crowd. The child was alive. With renewed energy, the rescuers pushed harder. Finally, the small body emerged, covered in dust, trembling but breathing. The crowd erupted, some sobbing, others cheering, as the child was lifted into Traoré's arms. In that moment, every distinction of power dissolved. He was not a president holding a political symbol. He was a man holding life itself. The cameras zoomed in on his face, streaked with dirt, yet glowing with relief. He whispered something softly to the child, words drowned by the surrounding roar, but his expression spoke louder than any speech ever could. Meanwhile, in the distant conference room, delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They checked their watches, whispered among themselves, and frowned at the delay. Some were offended, others confused. But when the first shaky live videos began spreading online, showing Traoré in the rubble, the entire narrative flipped. World leaders who had once prepared to criticize his absence now watched in silence, confronted by a truth they could not ignore. The question hung in the air. What truly defines leadership? Is it the ability to sign treaties under chandeliers, or is it the courage to kneel in the dirt for a single life? As the videos went viral, millions across the globe answered for themselves. And for the people of his nation, watching their president carry a child out of rubble, the answer was crystal clear. The convoy should have returned him immediately to the palace. Advisors begged him to rush back before the summit collapsed. But Traoré didn't move. With the child now cradled in his arms, he walked slowly through the dust, surrounded by people whose faces were wet with tears. Mothers reached for his sleeve, fathers raised clenched fists of gratitude, and children stared wide-eyed at the leader they had only seen on posters. It wasn't the carefully choreographed reception of diplomats. It was raw, unfiltered love. A medical team arrived, with a stretcher, but Traoré gently shook his head. He wanted to carry the child himself, not as a performance, but because he understood that this was no ordinary rescue. This moment was a living symbol. So he walked, step by step, out of the rubble and into the waiting ambulance. He placed the child gently inside, whispered something only the child could hear, and then stepped back. The mother collapsed at his feet, clutching the hem of his shirt, sobbing uncontrollably. Traoré knelt down, lifted her to her feet, and embraced her, as if she were family. News spreads fast, but in the digital age, it spreads like fire. By the time the ambulance sped away, hashtags had already begun to trend. Videos captured by bystanders ricocheted across social media. "President saves child," the captions read, accompanied by clips of his dust-covered hands and exhausted face. Within minutes, the footage had reached living rooms, smartphones, and television networks far beyond his country's borders. In the summit hall, aides scrambled to control the narrative. Some feared embarrassment. What would other nations think of a leader who abandoned them mid-conference? But then the viral clips reached the delegates themselves. Phones buzzed across the polished tables, and one by one, the leaders leaned back, staring in stunned silence. The image of Traoré lifting debris wasn't a diplomatic faux pas, it was a master class in humanity. Journalists who had rehearsed talking points about economic policy were suddenly rewriting their scripts. Anchors who expected to analyze trade disputes were now replaying shaky videos of a president covered in dirt. Commentators who normally spoke in stiff tones of politics were suddenly emotional, some even choking up on air. The story had escaped the control of spin doctors and entered the realm of legend. But for Traoré himself, there was no calculation. He didn't stay at the site for cameras, nor did he return to the palace for applause. Instead, he followed the ambulance quietly to the hospital. There, in the sterile hallways smelling of disinfectant and echoing with urgent footsteps, he waited like any anxious parent would. Guards stood at a respectful distance. Reporters tried to sneak in, but he waved them away. This wasn't for the public. This was for the child. Doctors worked quickly, removing dust from the child's lungs, checking for fractures, monitoring breathing. Every second felt longer than the negotiations he had abandoned. When the doctor finally emerged and announced, "The child will recover," a wave of relief passed over everyone. Traoré closed his eyes, exhaled deeply, and, for the first time that day, allowed himself to smile. At that exact moment, thousands of miles away, commentators debated the consequences of his decision. Some accused him of neglecting international duty. Others defended him passionately, arguing that this single act had done more for his nation's reputation than any summit ever could. Because in an age where politicians are often seen as distant, self-serving figures, here was a man willing to risk criticism, alliances, even his image, for the life of a child who could not vote, could not protest, could not influence policy. The contrast was stark. Inside conference halls, leaders argued endlessly about numbers on papers. Outside in the real world, a man chose dust over chandeliers, sweat over speeches, a human life over handshakes. And that contrast struck something deep in millions of hearts. In the hospital waiting room, Traoré sat on a simple wooden chair, still in his dust-stained shirt. A nurse brought him water, which he accepted gratefully. He asked nothing about the summit. Instead, he asked about the other victims of the collapse, how many were safe, how quickly families were being reunited. His staff scribbled notes, not about treaties, but about relief measures. Then, unexpectedly, the child's mother approached him again, her eyes swollen from crying. She whispered, "You could have been anywhere today, but you came here." Her voice trembled. Her hands shook, but her words carried more weight than any applause in a conference hall. Traoré simply placed a hand over his heart and said, "No child should face danger alone." By the time he finally left the hospital, the sun was setting, painting the sky in orange and crimson. Crowds had gathered outside, chanting his name. Some carried posters, others simply waved, but all of them felt something rare: pride that their leader had chosen them over the world stage. Later that night, as he finally returned to the palace, his advisors rushed to brief him on what he had missed. The summit had paused. Delegates were waiting. Journalists demanded explanations. But he raised his hand, stopping the torrent of words. "We'll speak to them tomorrow," he said firmly. "Tonight, we honor the families." And so, instead of delivering a political speech to foreign dignitaries, he delivered a heartfelt address to his own people, broadcast live across the nation. Standing before the cameras, still wearing the marks of the day's ordeal, he spoke not of policies, but of values. Leadership, he said slowly, is not measured by the meetings you attend. It is measured by the lives you touch. His words reverberated far beyond national borders. Clips of his address were translated into multiple languages, shared by influencers, debated by commentators, and admired by citizens who longed for leaders who cared more about people than power. Overnight, his image transformed from a regional figure into a global symbol of moral courage. And yet, to those who knew him closely, none of this came as a surprise. Traoré had always believed that true authority wasn't about distance, but presence, not about commanding respect, but earning it. The rescue was not a performance, it was a revelation. The following morning, when Traoré finally entered the Grand Summit Hall, the atmosphere was unlike anything ever witnessed at such gatherings. The chandeliers still glittered, the flags still hung in perfect order, and the microphones still gleamed under stage lights. Yet every conversation, every whisper, was about the videos that had spread across the globe overnight. Delegates who had once been prepared to scold him now rose instinctively to their feet as he walked in, not out of protocol, but out of respect. He took his place at the center table, still wearing the same uniform, not freshly pressed, not polished, but marked with faint stains of dust from the day before. And that was enough to silence the room. Leaders who had perfected the art of appearances were suddenly confronted by the raw authenticity of a man who had chosen life over politics. The Greek agenda papers in front of them seemed strangely hollow in comparison. Before anyone could speak, Traoré leaned toward his microphone. His voice was steady, not rehearsed, but grounded in conviction. "Yesterday," he began, "the world expected me to be here. But the world will always wait. A child cannot. And if we, as leaders, forget this truth, then our agreements, our speeches, our signatures mean nothing." The hall was silent, but it was not the silence of disapproval. It was the silence of leaders forced to reflect on their own priorities. For a fleeting moment, titles and ranks dissolved, and every man and woman in that chamber remembered what power was meant to serve. Not ambition, but people. The rest of the summit unfolded differently than planned. Discussions were less rigid, less combative. Delegates spoke not only of treaties, but of values, of responsibility, of the gap between words and actions. Some credited Traoré directly, others spoke cautiously, but everyone knew the shift in tone had come from the decision he made in a dusty street rather than in a polished hall. Back home, the effect was even greater. In villages and cities, families replayed the videos again and again, not because of politics, but because of what they represented. For parents, it was the reassurance that their children mattered to the highest office in the land. For the young, it was proof that leadership could be human. For the elderly, it was a reminder that honor had not vanished from public life. Days later, when the rescued child was finally released from the hospital, the reunion was broadcast live. The child ran into the mother's arms, healthy, smiling, alive. Traoré attended quietly, standing at the back, refusing to make himself the center. But when the mother turned and spotted him, she pulled him into the embrace. Cameras captured the moment, and once again, it traveled around the world. The story had begun as a single act of compassion, but had now grown into a living symbol of what leadership could look like. Critics still tried to argue. They wrote columns questioning whether abandoning a summit was irresponsible, whether his decision risked alliances, whether it was reckless for a president to place himself in physical danger. But each critique was drowned out by the undeniable truth that millions had already seen with their own eyes. A leader who chose humanity over protocol. No argument, no headline, no editorial could erase the image of dust-stained hands lifting a fragile life out of rubble. And this is why the story refuses to fade. It is retold not because of political gain, but because it answers a question that many had stopped asking. What do we really want from those in power? Do we want them polished, rehearsed, and distant? Or do we want them willing to set aside the spotlight when a single child cries for help? For Ibrahim Traoré, the answer was simple, and his actions proved it. Leadership is not about being remembered in conference records. It is about being remembered in the lives of those who would otherwise have been forgotten. That day, he showed the world that true strength is not measured in military parades or international agreements. It is measured in the willingness to kneel in the dust, to carry the weight of bricks with your own hands, to cancel the schedules of the powerful for the heartbeat of the powerless. And so, when history records the summit of that year, it may mention trade deals and speeches, but what people will truly remember is the story of a president who walked out of marble halls to save a child, and in doing so, reminded the world what it means to lead.